Howdy, everyone. My name is Andrew Robison, and today I am looking for 10 people who would be willing to donate to my charity, Stuffies for All, so that we can provide lamb chop stuffies to children that are in psychiatric hospitals. Who's in? Okay, Peter in the back. Thank you very much. Let me try one more time, okay? Every year in the United States, over 36,000 children are admitted to acute psychiatric hospitals in the United States. On average, they stay 7 to 10 days. These children are lonely, they are scared, but in 2024, Dr. Esther Hess from the Center for Developing Children conducted a study. And in that study, she determined that children in stressful situations, when given a stuffed animal, see their anxiety levels significantly decrease and their emotional resilience increase. My charity, Stuffies for All, is dedicated to providing stuffed animals for all of these children. And today I'm looking for 10 people to donate to help make that possible. Who's in? Okay, got a couple more. Let me try this one more time. This is a picture of my daughter, Nora. This picture was taken on November 11th, 2023. And this day came at the end of one of the worst months and was in the middle of the worst 36 hours of her life and my life as a parent. You see, my daughter was diagnosed with bipolar and was in the middle of a manic episode that had gone on for a month at that time. Every day was punctuated by manic rage episodes to the point where on November 10th, we had to call 911 and have her admitted to the hospital because she was a threat to herself and a threat to the rest of my children. So we went to the hospital and I brought lamb chop so that she would have a stuffed animal for her because we knew that she'd be there for about a week. Well, as the nurse was taking her away, she looked at the stuffed animal and the nurse told me and told Nora, "You can't bring that stuffed animal with you." We were shocked. Why not? She said, "Well, if Nora has that stuffed animal, everybody's going to want a stuffed animal and we don't have enough." So every year in the United States, over 36,000 children are admitted to psychiatric hospitals for acute care. On average, they stay 7 to 10 days. In 2024, Dr. Esther Hess conducted a study in which she determined that children, when in stressful situations, when they have a stuffed animal, their emotional resilience increases and their anxiety level decreases. But honestly, I didn't need a study to tell me that. I knew that my daughter needed a stuffed animal. And again, they didn't have enough. So I'm on a mission to fix that. My charity, Stuffies for All, is dedicated to providing enough stuffed animals so that every child admitted to a psychiatric hospital will receive a lamb chop or a teddy bear or a Mickey Mouse, whatever they need to make that week or that 10 days a little bit more bearable. I'm looking for 10 people who will donate to this cause today. My wife and I are already in. We're all in, but we need 9 more. And I ask you again, who's in? Great. I don't really have a charity called Stuffies for All. I think there should be. But I want to ask you, of those 3 scenarios, scenario A, we need money. Scenario B, here's some facts that are important. We need money. And scenario C, here's my daughter. Here's her story. Can you please help? I ask you, which one, in your opinion, is more effective? See, do I have any brave people that say A? No. How many of you are at charities and or witness other nonprofits that default to scenario A too often? Or default to scenario B and they think they're doing good. They're sharing the facts. You're saying what the impact is, but they leave out the stories. So today, my presentation is about storytelling. And I'm going to talk about why storytelling works, what stories do to our brain when we hear them, what stories you should be telling as a fundraiser, and at the end, I'll give you a little bit of time to work on and craft your own stories. Does that sound good? Great, right on. Okay, let's start with why stories work. Stories work because people remember stories. Cognitive psychologist Jerome Bruna determined that people are 22 times more likely to remember information and facts when told in a story than just given those information and facts. 22 times. But why is that? Well, first of all, stories evoke an emotional experience. How many of you think back in your brain to when you're a kid or when you're younger and remember what are the moments that you remember in your life? How many of you remember them because there's an emotional connection? I can remember, oh gosh, it's been 18 years. I'm getting in trouble, 18 and a half years. October 7th, 2006, I had just gotten married. My wife and I, the priest says, I now introduce Mr. and Mrs. Andrew Robison. And we turn around, everybody's clapping. We start walking down the aisle, and I grab my wife's hand, and I hold it up, and I kiss it. And I can remember that moment like it happened 5 minutes ago. Well, why do I remember that? Because there was an emotional attachment. There's emotional experience attached to that moment. I had just gotten married. I was absolutely terrified, thrilled that I was getting married. And I remember that moment for the joy, for the excitement, for the enthusiasm. So stories evoke emotional experiences. Stories are usually told in a narrative format, right? There's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end. Our brain does this thing when we're trying to remember information. You don't know you're doing it, but you're doing it. And it's called stacking and chunking. And stacking is when our brain, it gets all this data all the time, right? And the way that it remembers it is that it stacks information that is similar to other data points that it's already got in its brain. That way it creates these sort of stacks in your brain to help it remember. Chunking is a similar where it groups information, individual information into groups, into chunks. And so when stories are in a linear format, beginning, middle, and end, we can remember the facts of that because they fit into that narrative and our brains are able to stack and chunk them a little bit easier. Stories work, people remember stories because they visualize, and that visualization triggers mental images. So we all know that some people learn by hearing, some people learn by seeing, but when you hear a story or when you read a story or when you see a story online, your brain creates mental images for that. And so it's almost like kind of compounding your senses to remember that story. You hear it, you read it, you see it in your brain. And people relate to characters and events. How many of you, when I was telling my lamb chop story, related in some way to somebody in that story or some event? Maybe as a parent, right? You related to me and my wife going through that situation. Maybe as a child, you struggled with stuff and you related to that. Maybe you know somebody and you relate. But whatever it is, your brain is always relating to the characters and the events and stories that you hear, even if you don't think about it, and that helps us to remember it. So, number one, stories work because people remember stories. Secondly, stories work because they actually affect us biologically. So there's 3 hormones that are released in our brain at all times when we hear, not at all times, but when we hear different stories. Those hormones are dopamine, oxytocin, and endorphins. So I'm gonna tell you another story. When I was 19 years old, I had just finished my 2 weeks training at a seafood restaurant. I was going to be a server, and my kitchen manager, Chris, he had his pilot's license. And so every now and then he used to grab a couple of guys and he'd go flying up at night. And so it was the end of my 2 weeks of training, and he said, "Hey, Andrew, you want to go for a flight around the city at night?" I was like, "Hell yeah, I do. Let's go." So we get out there, we drive out to this little municipal airport in LaPorte, Texas. And first thing happens is the plane won't start. And I'm like, "All right, Chris, maybe we won't go flying tonight." No, this happens all the time. Don't worry about it. So he pulls his car around, we hook up the jumper cables, and he jump starts the plane. I'm like, all right, let's go. So we all get in the plane, and there's 4 of us in there. It's a little 4-seater. Chris and Logan, another server, in the front seat. And I'm in the back sitting next to Carlos. Carlos was a great guy. But Carlos, you can probably picture Carlos in your mind when I tell you, Carlos worked in the kitchen. He was a dishwasher. He had one of those really long pinky nails, which I don't think I knew at the time why he had a really long pinky nail. But he also had a teardrop tattoo, and I definitely knew why he had a teardrop tattoo. But Carlos had always been nice to me, so I'm sitting next to Carlos, and we get in there in the plane. Chris does all of his checks and everything, and we start moving. And we get going, and we're going faster, and I'm guessing we're going probably 70, 80 miles an hour, and all of a sudden the plane takes off. And we get up in the air, and all of a sudden we're about 100 feet in the air, and I'm like, this is awesome. And then the plane banks really hard to one side, and I think, well, that's weird, but I don't know anything about flying planes. Maybe this is normal. So I'm looking out the windows trying to see what's going on. And this is a plane, some of you may know, but the wings are below the windows. So I couldn't see the ground when I was sitting in my seat. So I stretch my neck and I look out the front window. And what do you think I see out the front window? I see houses. And I think in my brain, if we're going up, I should not be seeing houses out of the front window. And so I think, this is not good. And then I hear 11 words that I will remember till the day I die. And it's Carlos sitting next to me saying, the ground, mate, you're too close to the ground. And you want to know what happens next? I'm not going to tell you. And the reason I'm not going to tell you is because the story is not about the plane. The story is what your brain is doing right now. Your brain is being flooded with dopamine. Dopamine are the hormones that make you engage in a story, that make you want to know more, that make you want to connect. And your brain is full of dopamine right now because you want to know what happens to me and Carlos and Logan and Chris, right? So as fundraisers, we can tell stories that engage our donors and release that dopamine, that makes them want to know more, that makes them curious, that makes them anxious about what's going to happen at the end of the story. So stories work because they release dopamine. The second hormone that stories can release is oxytocin. So remember back to that story, the lamb chop story, and maybe you were feeling something. Maybe you were feeling empathy for Nora, or maybe you were feeling empathy for me as a parent, or for my wife, or for the doctors, or somebody. The reason that you were feeling empathy is because your brain was being flooded with oxytocin at that moment. Oxytocin is also known as the love hormone. And it's called that because oxytocin is released when we're with somebody who is telling us something vulnerable, who is telling us something honest. It actually triggers the amygdala, which processes all the emotions in your brain. And elevated oxytocin levels increase trust, they increase empathy, they increase connection, and they help us to bond with other people. So oxytocin can also reduce anxiety and stress, so it promotes a sense of well-being. So when we tell stories with our donors, personal, vulnerable, human stories, it actually releases a hormone in their brain that makes us more trustworthy to them. And as fundraisers, what do you have to have with your donors in order to engage them in a philanthropic activity and a charitable donation? They have to be able to trust you. So that trust leads to a deeper connection, and that connection leads to inspiration to where people will believe, they'll engage, and ultimately they'll give. All right, the third hormone is the endorphins. So I'm going to take a little break here, and we're going to do an exercise, okay? So you 6 tables here, you guys are team A. I think I'm on the right side. Yeah. You guys are team A, and you guys are team B, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put an image on the screen, and I'm going to give you 30 seconds. I don't have my phone, so somebody time me 30 seconds. All right? And when I put this image on the screen, I want you, team A, only team A, to yell out all the uses that you can think of for this item that are on the screen. Everybody got it? All right, you ready? Who's got my timer? Perfect. Ready? Go. That's a brick. Buildings. I can't hear, so just yell. I don't care. Just yell. Wait. Break a window. Break a window. I love it. Getting out there. Doorstop. Good. It's a brick. A lot of uses for it. Paperweight. Patio. Great. Memento. Right? Yeah. A gift. A fundraising tool. Yeah. Time. All right. Thank you very much. Okay, now, team B, I'm going to give you 30 seconds with a different item, okay? But before I give you that, I'm going to tell you a story, okay? So my Uncle Steve, he's getting up there, right? He's a little bit older, and Uncle Steve was having some memory issues, right? And my dad had told me this, yeah, Uncle Steve, he's starting to forget things a little bit more. And then my dad tells me that my Uncle Steve went to the doctor, and the doctor gave him his medication, and it actually helped with his memory. So about a month ago, I was visiting my Uncle Steve, and I said, Uncle Steve, I heard that you were having some problems with your memory. Is that right? Yep, sure was, Andrew. Oh, okay. Well, what happened? I heard that you maybe went to a doctor. Yep, sure went to a doctor. Great. And what did the doctor do? He gave you a medication? Yep, gave me a medication. That's great, Uncle Steve. I'm really curious, though. What was the name of the medication? He goes, what was the name of that medication? Help me out here. What's the name of that flower, that really common flower? And I said, a daisy? No, not daisy. Not daisy. No, like the date flower. You might give it to, your wife when you're going on a date. Like a carnation? No, not a carnation. What are you, a cheapskate? No, that's a carnation. What's a flower? It's like that romantic, they're red, and you get them in a dozen. I was like, a rose? That's right, Rose. Hey, Rose, what's the name of that medication the doctor gave me? All right, Team B, ready, go. It's a brick. What are reasons? You have 30 seconds. What are some options that you can use for a brick? Engrave with a donor's name. Building. Self-defense. A tire stop. Pizza stone. Break something. What? Sidewalk. Football. I love it. Time. Okay, so the game was a little rigged, right? I get it, right? So the point is that by telling that story, and some of you laughed and some of you didn't, so maybe some of you got the endorphins and some of you didn't, right? And I get that. But endorphins, when they're in our brain, they actually make us more creative. So I heard football, right? You guys didn't think of football, duh, So when we have endorphins in our brain, which happen because they're called the feel-good hormones, right? So endorphins they hit our brain, or our brain produces them when we're laughing, when we're enjoying something, when we're having fun. Endorphins actually make us more open, more creative, and more engaged. So think about some of the fundraising events that maybe you've been to, right? And somebody gets up there and they are just killing it. They're telling jokes, you're laughing, you're having a great time. At the end of it, when they are asking you for money, you're in such a good mood, you think, absolutely, I will give you whatever you are asking for. Well, the reason that's happening is because those are the endorphins that are triggered in your brain. And so stories work because they produce endorphins. So as fundraisers, we cannot underestimate the power of joy. We have to be joyful, and we have to tell joyful, engaging, exciting, heartwarming stories in our work, in our one-on-ones with donors, on our social media, because they affect our donors' brains biologically. All right. And what's the third reason? So the first reason was stories work because people remember them. That was really scary. Yeah. Second reason, stories work because they affect our donors biologically, right? Or they affect all of us. Stories also work. The third reason I'm going to focus on is because they shape our identity and they influence our decisions. So what do I mean by that? So think back to when you were a kid, or maybe you have children right now. What was the best part of every bedtime process for either you when you were growing up or with your kids? What is the thing that every kid wants before they go to bed? Bedtime stories, right? And I can tell you, I have 4 kids. My oldest is 15. I have told a lot of bedtime stories. And when I say told bedtime stories, I read a lot of books. And I have read every single Berenstain Bear books. I promise you, every single Berenstain Bear book at least 100 times in my life. And I love those books. They're like just the right length. Now my son, he wants 2 books or 3 books. And now I'm like, hey, buddy, we got to draw the line somewhere. But Berenstain Bears are great because those stories are full of life lessons. They're full of values. And I feel great reading those to my kids because I'm not just filling the time. I'm not just sort of getting them ready for bed, but I'm instilling in them values that I want them to grow up with in life. So in Get in a Fight, right? My kids learn about conflict resolution. And forget their manners. My kids learn about how to be more polite and how manners are a symbol of our generosity. And my personal favorite, nobody listens to Andrew, actually doesn't have a lot of life lessons, but unless you consider listening to Andrew to be a life lesson, absolutely, yeah. But this was my favorite book growing up, and I read it all the time, and nobody ever listened to me when I read it. That's what he said. But stories influence our character, they teach us values, and they influence our decisions. But what about as adults? So I'll tell you another story about a guy named Danny Thomas. So Danny Thomas was born in 1912, some people say 1914, and he was born into a poor gypsy family in Toledo, Ohio. And they were Maronite Catholic, they had immigrated, his parents had. And when Danny was about 8 or 9 years old, his younger brother got very sick. And the doctors didn't know what to do, nobody knew what to do. And his mother, Margaret, fell on her knees and prayed, "Dear God, save my baby, and I will dedicate the next year of my life to begging alms for you." So that was what Margaret prayed. And miraculously, the child was saved, made a full recovery, grew up to be nice and young and old and healthy. Danny, about 25, 28 years later, Danny was in a similar situation. Wasn't quite as dire, but he had 2 kids, and Danny really wanted to be an entertainer, but it just wasn't working. And he got to know St. Jude. He had seen a prayer card and had somebody tell him about St. Jude. And so Danny, at a 5 a.m. mass, prayed to St. Jude and to God, "God, please save my career, save my work, my life, and I will dedicate my life to building a shrine for St. Jude." And a couple of years later, Danny was one of the biggest movie stars. He had movies, he had his own TV show. He was a nightclub entertainer, one of the most popular in the United States. He was touring with the USO. Danny's star had risen. His career was saved. And miraculously, he honored his promise to God. And Danny then spent the next 10 years fundraising and the next 30 years of his life running St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. How many of you have ever heard of St. Jude's? Yep, absolutely. So Danny, the way he fundraised is he would go around and he would get together these groups of people and he would tell jokes, right? Get those endorphins going. But one story he always told was about his little brother and about his mother, Margaret, falling to her knees and praying, "Dear God, save my baby." And he said, because that's what I'm doing. And that's what we want to do with this hospital. We want to save the kids that are unsavable. St. Jude is the patron saint for hopeless causes. We are building a shrine for St. Jude that will allow these children to have life when nobody else thought they would otherwise. And people gave millions of dollars to this because they saw in themselves, they saw in Danny the values that they wanted for themselves. And those stories that Danny told influenced their actions. So stories work because they shape our identity and they influence our decisions. So now you're probably thinking, this is great. I am totally in on telling more stories, right? The question is, what story should I tell? And I'm going to suggest that you have 3 stories in your story toolkit that you can pull out at any time and tell to anybody. All right, what are those 3 stories? 1, I think everybody should have a personal story that they can tell to anybody at any time, but in particular to our donors. And working for the church, we all have kind of a built-in story, right? It's our conversion story. And maybe we didn't have a conversion. But at some point in our life, we chose our faith. We chose God. And that is a story that inspires other people. I'll tell you mine real quick. And I've told this story, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of times. When I was I did 2 years of junior college, and then I went and I lived in the mountains of Colorado, worked at a ski resort, ended up in Colorado Springs waiting tables. And there was a girl there, and she was cute, and I liked her. And we were hanging out, and I knew I was only gonna be there for a couple months. We were hanging out, and one Saturday night, I was leaving her apartment. And there were a bunch of people over there, and so she kind of walks me to the door, and she was cute. I wanted to hang out with her more. And I said, "Hey, what are you doing tomorrow morning?" She goes, "I don't know." I said, "You wanna go to church with me?" Never had we talked about church. Never. I knew that somewhere in the back of my brain, I thought, I wonder if Victoria's Catholic. I don't know. But I invited her to church, and she shocked me, miracle of miracles, and said, yeah, I think I do. And so we went to church the next morning. And we went to church every Sunday morning for about the next couple of weeks before I moved home. Well, that moment, that invitation that God put on my heart to invite Victoria to go to church with me, I don't know, we lost touch. I don't know if she continued to go to church, but that imprinted on me the power that we all have as evangelists. And so when I started school at Texas A&M, I was kind of primed to get back into my faith. And so I got involved. I went on a retreat. I met another cute girl. We got married after school. Now we have 4 kids and a dog and a bearded dragon and have a great life, right? But that's what the power of a personal story can do. And I told that story to donors all the time, right? It's not an invasively personal story, but it shows my vulnerability. It shows what moment that moved me, that God put on my heart to have a change of heart. And that's a story that inspires and that builds trust. It releases that oxytocin in whoever I'm talking to, and they have a deeper connection to me just by simply telling that story. So the first story in your story toolkit is a personal story that you can use to build trust with your donors. It doesn't have to be a conversion story, it can be anything, but personal, vulnerable stories build that trust. Secondly, I would suggest a ministry impact story to build connection and interest, which releases dopamine and endorphins in our donors' brains. So when I was working at the medical school, so in the midst of my career, I worked for the Texas A&M Foundation. I worked for the medical school for about 7 years. And when I started, I knew nothing about medical school. I didn't know how long it was. I didn't know what you had to do. I didn't know how much it costs. And so I was like, I got to fundraise for this? Well, I got to figure it out. And so what I started to do is I started to get on the interview team to interview prospective medical students. And that was the most impactful experience for me as a fundraiser to learn the stories of our students. So when I was meeting with a donor, I was able to tell them, here's the kids that are coming to our medical school. And that was an impact story. And then I got to know them. I followed the ones that after they finished. So for you who don't know, you do 40 years of medical school, then you do a residency. Residency can be 4 years, maybe 2 years, 4 years, 8 years, and then you get to be a doctor, right? And so I got to know my alumni who were in the residency, and I learned about what they were doing. And so I didn't have any personal connection to the medical school. I am not a doctor. I don't have any doctors. I didn't have a personal connection, but I could tell about the work that our school, our institution was doing through the stories, through the examples of our students. And so you, as a fundraiser, think about what are some impact stories that you can tell that will inspire connection and interest from your donors. And just one little point, people connect with individuals more than they connect with a group of people. So when you're thinking about a ministry impact story, it's great to know the facts, right? 36,000 children a year end up in acute psychiatric hospitals. But how much more inspiring is it to know that my daughter, Nora, ended up in acute psychiatric hospital for a week? So when you're thinking of your impact stories, think about the individuals whose lives are changed and tell their stories to your donors. And then the third story is a donor impact story. So giving, philanthropy is a communal activity, right? People want to know that somebody else is giving and then they'll jump on board. People always want to be I don't say that. People want to know that other people are supporting an organization or a cause, right? It's a communal activity. So a donor impact story is a very valuable story that you can tell. One that I tell all the time is, so when I was working at St. Mary's, it was my first job, and we started this program called the Class Gift Program. And the Class Gift Program was very simple. We asked our college seniors to make a $1,000 pledge. They paid that out over 50 months at $20 and whatever their class year was cents. So the first year that we did this was class of 2005. And so our graduates, they made a 50-month, 5-year, about a 4.5-year pledge, $20.05 to pay that $1,000. So that first class gift was great. We raised $52,000 from 52 students. And the next year, about a year later, I was kind of a chaperone or a table group leader for a senior retreat at St. Mary's. And Cassie, one of the class of 2005, came back and was sitting with me. And she said, Andrew, I got to talk to you about that class gift. And I was like, oh, what did I do? I felt a little guilty at first. And then she said, I am so grateful that you did that. I am so thankful. Every month when I look at my credit card statement, I see that $20.05 to St. Mary's, and I am instantly reminded of the impact that experience had on me, and I am grateful, and I actually want to give more. And so I am so grateful for that. So I was very pleased to hear that. Well, we put that story into a newsletter. Somebody read it from the class of 1949, called up and said, what are these young kids doing giving all this money? We should be giving them money. So then he started the class of the 1940s class gift. And then somebody from the class of 1950s started it. So donor impact stories can be very simple, but they demonstrate a few things. They demonstrate that other people are giving. Giving is easy. You can have an impact, and that we are a trustworthy organization. Remember that oxytocin. We are a trustworthy organization that you should feel good about giving to. So 3 stories in your story tool belt: a personal story to build trust, a ministry impact story to build that connection and show the impact, and a donor impact story to illustrate and to demonstrate that you are a trustworthy organization people can give to. All right. So what we're going to do now is, what do I got? 20 minutes, Peter, till 9:30? All right, great. So we're going to spend, I want you to partner up, all right, not as a table, but find an individual partner and partner up and start thinking about what your 3 stories are. I promise you, you have told these stories before. I promise you that you probably told them a lot of times, probably to donors. But I want you to think about how you would categorize. If you had to have 3 stories, a personal story, a ministry story, and a donor story, what those stories would be, and talk with your partner. I'm going to give you 10 minutes, partner up. If I see this as a table of 3, if you have to get in a group of 3, that's fine. Tell your stories, talk about this, and I'm going to give you about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back. Sound good? Or who wants to nominate their partner to share their story? I like that idea better. Anybody? One brave person. All right, in the back.
My story, this is the personal story. It was a time in my life. I'm currently the director of administration at a parish, and been a member of the parish about 11 years. But prior to the parish, I worked nearby. And before joining this parish, my wife and I were going through some difficult times. There were things that were going on. We were going back and forth. And I would go to this parish, and it's holy name of Mary. And at lunch, I would pray the rosary. I just needed help. I needed to get through what we're going through. So I needed help. Every day I come and pray the rosary. One day, Mary came, and she just hit me with a hand. She laid me bare. She opened everything up. Everything that was going on got exposed. I'm talking to my wife. We cried. We cried for hours going through this conversion process. After that, my wife and I are stronger than ever. We just celebrated 35 and a half years of marriage. She's my best friend. We made it through all that. And as luck had it, I'm back at this parish. I wasn't a member at the time. And now I'm the business manager and director of administration.
Thank you for sharing. What's your name? Eric. Thank you very much, Eric. So, Eric, do you mind if I use that as an example and sort of ask for ideas? Great. So, who here heard Eric's story and can connect it to some point that was made earlier? Yes.
So what was the idea connected with me? What person?
So, Eric's story, what was some point that came out of that story that we talked about earlier? Did it affect you?
Oh, the emotional thing with struggles in marriage, for sure.
Yeah, so you related to his story, right? Whatever your situation is, there is a relational moment that you apply to your own life by hearing Eric's story, right? So by having that increased relationship or that increased, what am I saying? By connecting with him, you have a higher and a deeper level of trust for Eric just by simply him telling you that story in 90 seconds. Would everybody agree? Yeah. So, Eric, have you ever shared that story with a donor or in a situation like that?
We're actually right now going through a stewardship campaign.
Yeah.
And I put that story on a video that we're going to put on our website.
Great. So, very powerful use of that. There's a fine line here, right? I don't want to encourage you to exploit your stories for manipulation of your donors, right? That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that it can feel, I put a lot of my stories and Nora's stories on LinkedIn, right? If you go follow me on LinkedIn, then a lot of my stories are there. And people are always saying, some people are saying, why do you put that stuff on there? This is, it's LinkedIn, it's for work, and work stories. Why are you telling about your dark story? I have just as many, if not more people that reach out to me and say, oh my God, thank you so much for telling that story, because that is my story, or that is my family story. And knowing that I'm not alone in that is powerful. So I'm not saying to exploit your stories. I'm saying there is power in our stories that we are conditioned to keep to ourselves. And yet, when we are in this work of fundraising, in this work of ministry, we can build those bonds and build those connections in ways that we never thought, just by simply sharing those stories that we would not feel comfortable otherwise. Okay? Does anybody else want to share? Thank you very much, Eric. Really appreciate that. All right. Oh, yes, sister.
This is from one of our donors who is here to us. And he told me this story, how he began to be more involved in philanthropy. And he, as a good Catholic, he was not taught how to tithe. And so he was going through financial difficulties, very, very severe financial difficulties. And he was at the point, he told me, at the end of his rope. And he was even considering to kill himself. I don't know, men, it's very hard for them not to be able to provide for their families. Wow. And he came to this point. And as he was struggling with all these thoughts, he told me that his daughter came to him with a bubble gum wrapping. And he said, Daddy, smell it, how good it smells. And so he smelled the bubble wrapping. And at that moment, it was a moment of grace, because he said, these joys, little joys of life, is what it's all about. And so he also was going to see his parish priest, and he told him, have you considered beginning tithing? And he said, but Father, I'm going through such terrible difficulty. He said, just start very small. Think about 1% of what you earn, and set it apart, and little by little increase it and see what happens. And this is something that we have seen in several of our donors. I personally know a few who have a similar story, that as they began tithing, for whatever reason, their financial situation began to improve. And I know that I'm not an advocate for the prosperity gospel, I'm not, but I have seen that has been the experience of several of our donors, and he was one of them. And little by little, he began tithing until he reached the 10% of his income as a Catholic, which is unheard of. and he began telling other people this story and encouraging other Catholics to give as well, and also to begin little by little until they hit that mark, 10% of their income. So that was a success story, and he became eventually very financially successful. Yeah, well. And he's a very good friend of ours, and he even claims to be related to me.
Thank you very much. So thank you, sister. What's something about her story that stood out to you as sort of a meaningful moment or a point that is helpful for you?
Just smelling of the gum wrapper, it evokes the senses.
Yeah.
Sensually in the stories.
Yeah, very good point. I wouldn't even think about that. Great. Thank you very much. Anything else?
Wanting to support your family.
That's very relatable, right? We all, anybody can feel like they're in that situation of, yeah, I want to do more, but I also want to support my family. And so it gave kind of a real pathway to being able to do both. Yeah, great. Thank you very much, sister. That was lovely. All right, so let's wrap up here. So just to recap, right? Stories work because people remember stories. Stories affect us biologically by the release of dopamine, oxytocin, and endorphins. And stories shape our identity. And what stories should we have in our story tool belt? Personal stories to build trust, ministry stories to connect, and donor impact stories to inspire. And after all that, I want to encourage you, tell more stories to strangers, right? The people that we get to know in our relationships, in our work as fundraisers, many of them, in some cases, all of them, they start out as strangers. But it's through storytelling, it's through the power of those stories that we build those relationships and we build those bonds. I just want to close with this. So at the beginning, I asked people, I said, I'm starting a charity, please donate. And actually, Peter did raise his hand on the back. And another point to this, he said, well, I raised my hand because I know you, right? So people give to people, right? People also give to stories. And so think about the difference in asking for money and inspiring radical generosity. That's the difference between saying, we need donations. And let me tell you about a little girl who spent a week in a psychiatric hospital, and all she wanted was a stuffed animal. Will you please help? So your stories have power. They have power to encourage. They have power to inspire. So I encourage you to tell more stories. You are giving gifts to your donors every time you tell stories, whether it's one-on-one, whether it's in a newsletter, whether it's on social media, whether it's in a video. You are giving the gift of joy, of these release of endorphins, of hope, of inspiration. So in a way, by telling stories, we are giving gifts to our donors before we're ever asking. So my question to you is, what gifts will you give to your donors, and what stories will you tell? Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for being so engaging, and God bless. Sure. So BOAT is a program. It's an all online digital course. It's cohort based. It takes 10 weeks to go through, and it covers all the foundations of fundraising. We have a cohort that's going right now. Well, I think we'll start another one in the spring and then another in the fall. You can learn about it at petrusdevelopment.com/BOAT. We've got other courses on there as well.